Did you
The
see that
forest has
again?
always been a place of shadows, but in
I
this
felt it
land,
more than
there
saw
is
it.
one that whispers with a voice
getting
older
closer.
than memory. Locals call it the Forest of Bones, not for any mapmaker's record, but because of what was once found beneath its canopy. Long before cities rose around it, before roads pressed their scars into the earth, it was said to be the place where children vanished. Some believed they had been abandoned there by desperate families. Others swore the trees themselves claimed them, swallowing their small voices until only silence remained. And yet, if one listens closely, on certain nights the silence is broken, not by the call of an owl, nor the shifting of branches, but by something softer, a child's cry, a chorus of them, carried through the undergrowth, as though the past itself refuses to stay buried. The story does not begin with discovery, but with unease. Travelers spoke of stumbling upon skeletal remains half buried in moss, fragile bones arranged in strange patterns, as though the forest had curated its own grim shrine. At first, these reports were dismissed as superstition, tales exaggerated to keep children from wandering too far into the trees. But the whispers persisted. A shepherd claimed his flock refused to graze near the tree line. A woodcutter swore he found a doll, worn and weathered, sitting atop a stone, as if placed there deliberately. Then came the accounts of children themselves, who entered the forest chasing after berries or fireflies, and returned pale and trembling, muttering about voices calling their names. It is a story that, like the roots of the trees, stretches deep into the soil of history. Centuries ago, during times of hunger and pestilence, families were forced to make choices that cannot be easily spoken of. Some say parents, unable to feed all their children, left the weakest behind beneath those very branches. Others insist these are fabrications meant to rationalize something darker, something the rational mind cannot easily contain. What happened to those left behind? Were they claimed by famine, disease, or something far older and less forgiving? As the name suggests, bones are central to this legend. The forest floor, rich with rot and renewal, often reveals pale fragments after heavy rains. Archaeologists have studied them, yet many refuse to confirm their origins publicly. Were these remnants truly from children, or simply the scatterings of plague pits forgotten by time? The hesitation of scholars only fuels speculation, for when answers are withheld, the imagination fills the silence with dread. And in this forest, dread is not just a feeling, it is a presence, heavy and unrelenting. The villagers who live nearby rarely speak of it openly. Some cross themselves when its name is uttered, others fall quiet altogether, their eyes shifting to the ground as if afraid the trees might overhear. Folklore has woven itself into their daily lives. Mothers warn children not to wander after dusk. Fathers refuse to cut wood from its heart, no matter how dire the winter. To outsiders, these may seem like quaint superstitions, but for those who live under the shadow of the Forest of Bones, they are rules of survival. Even now, in the age of satellites and electric light, the forest resists intrusion. Hikers who enter speak of compasses spinning wildly, of paths that seem to rearrange themselves, leading them back to the same spot, no matter how far they walk. Some return shaken, claiming they heard laughter carried on the wind, laughter that did not belong to any living child. A few never return at all. Authorities chalk these disappearances up to accidents, poor navigation, or wild animals. Yet for locals, the explanation is already written in their folklore. The forest keeps what it has been given. To begin with this story is to step into uncertainty, where history bleeds into myth, and myth stains the record of the past. For centuries, people have asked the same questions we will ask tonight. Who were the children left in that forest? Why were they abandoned? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what became of them? The answers lie buried, not only in the soil and bones, but in the collective memory of a people who would rather forget. But forgetting is never complete. Ghosts have a way of whispering through the cracks of time, and in the Forest of Bones, they whisper loudly. They ask us to remember what others have tried to bury, the cruelty of desperation, the weight of superstition, and the possibility that some tragedies refuse to remain bound by history. Whether one believes in curses, in restless spirits, or simply in the consequences of human despair, the story of the children left behind is not easily dismissed. It lingers like mist, clinging to the trees, waiting for anyone brave or foolish enough to step inside. This is where our journey begins, at the edge of the forest, where myth and memory intertwine. Step carefully, for every path that leads inward is also a descent, not just into the woods, but into the darkest corners of our collective past. To search for the truth of what happened here is to walk a fragile line between fact and folklore, between history and haunting. And once you enter, it is said, the forest never truly lets you go. The first traces of the Forest of Bones do not come from the villagers who whisper of it now, but from fragments of older records that lie hidden in archives and crumbling manuscripts. To understand what happened there, we must turn our gaze backward, to the centuries when parchment bore the weight of truth and superstition side by side. In one of the earliest surviving parish chronicles, dated to the late 17th century, there is a peculiar entry written in the hand of a weary clergyman. He speaks of the forsaken ones, children who vanished into the woods during a season of hunger, never to be seen again. The language is sparse, the tone almost clinical, yet between the lines is an unspoken terror. Why would a man of God, tasked with recording births, baptisms, and deaths, speak of the lost not as victims, but as offerings? The passage is brief, as if he feared writing more might summon a curse, or perhaps invite questions he could not answer. Other traces emerge in the diaries of travelers, merchants, soldiers, and wandering friars who crossed the region in search of trade or salvation. One such diary, belonging to a German apothecary who journeyed through the area in 1703, describes a forest that locals refused to name. He writes of encountering a village where doors were barred against him and children were hidden from sight. When he inquired about the woods, the innkeeper's wife spat on the floor and muttered a single phrase, "Better no child than a child taken." The apothecary, ever rational, assumed she spoke of wolves or bandits, but his account trembles at the edges. He writes of hearing faint laughter in the night, carried across the fields, though no children were visible by day. The folklore itself is older still. Scholars of oral traditions trace the tale of abandoned children deep into the Middle Ages, long before any official record dared to mention it. Songs once sung by shepherds tell of white bones under black branches, of small footprints leading into the trees but never out again. Some lullabies preserved by grandmothers in the region still carry verses that warn little ones not to wander, lest the forest call them by name. What is chilling is not merely the warning, but the specificity, verses that seem to speak of real events, transformed into rhyme so that memory could endure where records fell silent. Legends of lost children are not unique to this place. Across Europe, folk tales often echo the themes of hunger, abandonment, and predation, but what sets this story apart is its grounding in the physical world. For here, unlike in fairy tales of gingerbread houses or enchanted groves, bones have been unearthed. And while folklore may twist over centuries, bones do not lie. The combination of both, a tangible reminder in the soil and a living legend on the lips of villagers, suggests that behind the story of the Forest of Bones lies something more than simple superstition. The 18th century brought with it a wave of religious anxiety. Witch trials raged across the continent, and the church sought to root out superstition wherever it lingered. Yet, curiously, when it came to this forest, the records are muted. Where one might expect denunciations of pagan rites or accusations of sorcery, there is instead absence pages where the forest is not mentioned at all, even when famine stalked the land and children starved. Some historians suspect deliberate omission, a quiet erasure meant to protect reputations or suppress panic. After all, what monarch or priest would wish to admit that entire groups of children had been abandoned, or that something unholy prowled in the woods under their watch? Still, fragments survive in unexpected places. A legal document from 1721 details a dispute between two villages over hunting rights near the forest. In the margins, a clerk scrawled a note: "No game worth the fear, no man dares enter where the forsaken cry." It is a haunting aside, a line that would mean nothing to the court but everything to us, for it reveals that even among officials, the legend of the crying children was known and feared. And then there are the maps. Cartographers of the 18th and 19th centuries sometimes marked the area with strange symbols, notations of danger, sketches of skeletal trees, or curious Latin phrases such as silva damnata, the accursed wood. Unlike the blank spaces of ordinary forests, this one was drawn with intention, as if the mapmaker himself knew that to leave it bare would be to risk misunderstanding its danger. These maps tell us not only of geography, but of the weight of belief, the invisible borders that fear can carve into the land. Oral testimonies collected in the 19th century add further depth. Folklorists traveling through rural communities recorded grandmothers who spoke of times of famine when food was so scarce that families faced impossible choices. Better to leave two in the forest, one elderly woman confessed in a quavering voice, than for all six to perish. Whether this was a memory of her ancestors' choices, or merely a story passed down, the horror lingers. These testimonies suggest a grim truth, that abandonment may have been not myth but necessity, a practice born from desperation, and later buried under layers of folklore to mask the shame. Yet, alongside these human explanations, the supernatural clings stubbornly to the narrative. Villagers told collectors of lights that danced among the trees of children seen wandering in groups long after any could have survived. Some claimed that those who vanished were not truly dead, but taken by something older than men, spirits of the forest, or perhaps the devil himself, demanding tribute in exchange for sparing the village. These accounts blur the line between memory and myth, but their persistence across centuries suggests that whatever occurred in the Forest of Bones was so terrible, so unthinkable, that only the language of the supernatural could contain it. Thus, from scattered chronicles, travelers' diaries, songs, maps, and testimonies, a pattern begins to emerge. The story of the Forest of Bones is not a single tale, but a chorus of voices spanning centuries, each adding a layer to the mystery. Some speak of famine and abandonment, others of curses and demons, some whisper of human cruelty, others of forces beyond comprehension. And it is here, in this web of records and folklore, that we begin to see the true shape of the question before us. What happened to the children left behind in that forest? Were they casualties of hunger, erased by their families to save the rest? Were they victims of violence, of ritual, of something too shameful to confess? Or were they drawn into a darker fate, one that even now defies reason? The chronicles do not give us answers, only shadows, hints, and whispers that beckon us deeper into the woods. And as with all forests of history, the deeper we go, the darker the path becomes. History, like the forest, is filled with shadows. To understand what might have happened to the children of the Forest of Bones, we must step into the world from which their tragedy was born, an age where hunger, disease, and fear governed every choice, and mercy was a luxury few could afford. It was a time when villages clung to survival like flickering candles, each gust of war or plague threatening to extinguish them entirely. The centuries in which this legend took root were marked by recurring cycles of famine. Crops failed often, not from one cause but many. Bitter winters stole seed from the soil, rains drowned the harvest, locusts descended in swarms that stripped fields to nothing. When famine struck, it did not discriminate. It starved peasant and noble alike, though the poor always bore the worst of it. For families already burdened with too many mouths to feed, hunger forced impossible choices. Bread was hoarded for the strongest, the healthiest, those deemed capable of labor. The weakest, the young, the sick, the illegitimate, were sometimes left behind. Alongside famine, plague swept through Europe in waves. By the 17th century, outbreaks still surged every few decades, reducing villages to half their number in a matter of weeks. Fear of contagion bred cruelty. Children showing the first signs of illness were sometimes hidden away, sent into the woods in the hope that their removal might save the rest. We think of parents as protectors, but history reveals another truth. Parents too were captives of fear, driven to decisions that seem monstrous to us, but may have felt like the only way to preserve the living. Wars too carved their scars across the land. Soldiers marching between kingdoms left more than blood in their wake. They stripped villages of grain, salted fields, conscripted the able-bodied, and left behind widows, orphans, and famine. During such campaigns, the countryside filled with what chroniclers called the wandering children, bands of the young abandoned by families who could no longer protect them. Many vanished without record. Were some of them drawn into the forest we now fear? Did the forest of bones become one of the countless unmarked graves left in war's shadow? What makes this history more chilling is the way society justified such abandonment. Children were not always viewed with the sanctity we place upon them today. In times of desperation, they were weighed like resources, measured for what they could contribute or consume. A child too frail to labor, too small to guard the fields, or too young to be useful, was in cruel terms a liability. The decision to leave them behind may not have been seen as murder, but as grim necessity. In the silence of the woods, starvation would complete what parents could not bring themselves to do. And yet, history rarely tells such stories plainly. Official records are often silent on acts that society wishes to forget. Parish ledgers might note missing children, but they cloak reality in vague language. Court documents, when they mention abandonment at all, speak in euphemisms: forsaken for want, delivered to the elements, sent into the wilderness. These phrases sound poetic, but they are masks, veiling acts of cruelty, with words that make them sound almost merciful. But mercy is not found in the cries of a child left to wander among trees as darkness falls. The psychological landscape of the age was no less brutal. Fear was everywhere. Fear of witches, fear of curses, fear of divine punishment for sins both imagined and real. A child born outside wedlock, a child born during an eclipse, a child who fell ill too often, each might be seen as marked, dangerous, cursed. In times of crisis, such children were easy scapegoats. To abandon them in the forest was not only an act of desperation, but in the minds of some, an act of purification, a way to cut away rot before it could spread. This way of thinking, horrifying to us now, was woven into the survival strategies of villages clinging to life. The forest in this context was not chosen by accident. Forests were places of both fear and utility. They offered wood for fuel, game for meat, herbs for medicine, but they were also places of exile, liminal zones where society sent what it could not hold within itself. Criminals were sometimes left in woods to die. Plague victims were buried there in shallow graves. For children, the forest became both tomb and symbol, a place where their disappearance could be rationalized as a natural return to the wilderness. The villagers who left them there could tell themselves the forest had claimed them, rather than admit the truth that their own hands had delivered them to silence. Accounts from other regions echo this pattern. In parts of Scandinavia, folklore remembers the hunger winters, when families abandoned their youngest at the edge of frozen woods. In German folk tales, children lured into forests by hunger are eaten by witches, a narrative disguise for the far darker truth of starvation and neglect. In Eastern Europe, oral traditions recall the hollow years, when families vanished into forests and children returned alone, skeletal and silent. The story of the Forest of Bones is not isolated. It is part of a broader history of desperation, scattered across Europe like unmarked graves. When we place the legend against this backdrop, it becomes easier to see how truth and myth might have intertwined. Starvation, disease, and war created real abandoned children, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, whose fates went unrecorded. Their stories survived not in ledgers, but in whispers, in songs, in cautionary tales. Over generations, memory blurred into legend. The children of famine became the children of the forest, their bones transformed into symbols, their cries into ghostly echoes. What began as history hardened into folklore, until the two became indistinguishable. Yet, there remains something unsettling in the details. The skeletal remains unearthed in later centuries suggest more than simple abandonment. Some were found clustered together, as if left in groups. Others bore marks of violence, fractures not caused by animal scavenging but by human hands. These findings complicate the narrative. Hunger alone does not explain them, nor does plague. They hint at acts darker still, ritual, punishment, or communal purges carried out under the crushing weight of fear. The age in which the Forest of Bones took its victims was one of shadows, where survival demanded choices too grim to name. To us, centuries later, it is easy to condemn to see only cruelty. But to those who lived then, abandonment may have felt like the only path left. History is rarely merciful, and the forest, silent and watchful, remembers what human memory tries to bury. As we move deeper into the story, we must carry this truth with us, that the legend of the abandoned children is not a tale spun only of superstition. It is rooted in real hunger, real fear, real desperation. And though the children are long gone, their story remains carried by the soil, the bones and the whispers that echo between the trees. When we speak of the forest of bones, it is easy to let the story drift into abstraction, to talk of famine, of plague, of nameless figures swallowed by history. But behind the whispers and the legends were children, flesh and blood, who once bore names, who once laughed, cried, and dreamed. It is perhaps the greatest cruelty of this tale that their individual identities were stripped away, leaving us only with shadows. To reconstruct who they might have been, we must sift through what little the past allows us. Fragments of records, traces of oral memory, and the silences left behind. In the brittle pages of parish registers, names appear in long-forgotten ink, lists of baptisms, marriages, and deaths. Among these we sometimes find entries that stop abruptly. A child is recorded as born, perhaps even christened, yet no burial follows. The line simply ends, as if the child dissolved from the record. For some, this silence may be explained by migration or clerical neglect, but in regions near the forest, the gaps are too numerous to ignore. Entire clusters of children vanish from ledgers during years of famine. It is as though a generation slipped away into the trees, their absence noted only by the ink that should have been written, but was not. These children, historians believe, were often the youngest of large families. In times when survival depended on labor, infants and toddlers consumed resources, but could not yet contribute. Some may have been illegitimate, born of secret liaisons or violence in times of war, and thus considered expendable. Others may have been marked by illness, rickets, fevers, congenital deformities, that in a desperate household branded them as burdens rather than blessings. We can never know their faces, but we can imagine their lives, barefoot in dirt yards, clutching crusts of bread, eyes wide with the hunger that gnawed at every villager. There are darker possibilities still. In the testimonies gathered by folklorists, villagers spoke of children rumored to be touched by curse or witchcraft. A boy born with a caul, a girl who spoke to herself in the fields, a child whose siblings died one after another, while they alone survived. Such traits aroused suspicion in a superstitious age. These children may have been abandoned, not only out of necessity, but out of fear. To leave them in the forest was to remove a perceived danger from the community, to place the burden upon the land, rather than upon their kin. The evidence of bones adds weight to these suppositions. Archaeological surveys near the forest have uncovered remains of children, ranging from infants to adolescents. Many show signs of malnutrition, bowed legs, stunted growth, porous bone textures. These were children who lived hungry, and likely died hungrier still. Some skeletons bear marks of stress fractures, suggesting labor at an age far too young. They were not children as we understand them today, protected and cherished. They were fragile workers in a brutal world, their brief lives bent beneath necessity until they snapped. And yet, the most haunting truth is not in what we can know, but in what has been erased. Their names, their most human attribute, are gone. History did not preserve them as individuals, but as a collective, the lost children, the forsaken ones, the voices in the trees. Over time, their identities dissolved into archetype. They became symbols, warnings, phantoms. Their erasure was both practical and psychological. For the communities who abandoned them, it was easier to forget them as people and remember them only as shadows. For later generations, their story became more powerful in anonymity. A named child is a tragedy. Unnamed children become a myth. Still, sometimes a trace of individuality survives in folklore. In certain songs, the story is told not of children, but of a brother and sister, echoing tales of Hansel and Gretel, suggesting that real siblings may once have vanished together. In a lullaby recorded in the 19th century, a verse mentions Anneliese, who wandered and never came home. Was this the echo of a real girl's disappearance, carried through generations, until her name clung to a melody long after her story was forgotten. Such fragments tease us with the possibility that among the nameless, a few identities flicker faintly still. The fate of these children, whether they starved, were taken by disease, or fell prey to violence, is less difficult to imagine than the moment of abandonment itself. Picture it, a mother leading her youngest by the hand, her face hollow with hunger, knowing she cannot carry them further. A father turning his eyes away as his children stumble into the shadows, because to watch would break him. A sibling holding back tears, sworn to silence by the fear that to speak might bring the same fate upon them. These moments, repeated countless times, created the silence that still haunts the forest. What lingers is the inescapable sense of betrayal. Children trust. They follow where they are led. They believe the hand that guides them means safety. To be abandoned in the woods by that very hand is not only a death sentence, but a betrayal so profound it reverberates through legend. Perhaps that is why their voices are still said to cry from the forest. It is not only hunger or pain they echo, but confusion. Why were they left? Why did the people meant to protect them deliver them to the trees? This is why the story endures. The children of the Forest of Bones are not remembered as individuals, but as the embodiment of a universal fear, the fear of being abandoned, of being cast aside when no longer useful, of being forgotten. Their absence in records becomes presence in folklore. Their silence becomes a chorus of whispers carried by the wind, and so, even without names, they are remembered, not as they were, but as what they became, symbols of loss, of betrayal, of the thin line between survival and cruelty. The Forest of Bones holds no monuments, no gravestones carved with dates and epitaphs. Its memorial is the earth itself, where bones surface after rain, where trees grow twisted as though nourished by sorrow. The children who once bore names are now part of this landscape, their stories inseparable from its soil and roots. In this way, they live on, not as individuals but as a presence that refuses to fade, no matter how many centuries pass. The forest does not give up its secrets easily. For centuries, its silence was broken only by rumor and folklore, by the whispers of villagers who spoke of the children left to vanish beneath its branches. But eventually, silence yields to evidence. What had been legend for generations began to take on the weight of truth when the soil itself began to speak, and what it revealed was unsettling. It often begins after storms. Heavy rains loosen the soil, washing away the thin layers of earth that hide what lies beneath. Walkers in the forest have spoken of stumbling upon pale fragments jutting out of the ground, the curve of a small rib, the rounded dome of a child's skull, a hand's worth of finger bones strewn among leaves. At first, such finds were dismissed as scattered remains from unmarked plague pits, the kind that dot much of Europe's past. But as the years passed and the discoveries accumulated, a troubling pattern emerged. Too many bones, too many children, clustered too close together, and in places where no official burials were ever recorded. In the late 19th century, the first systematic attempts at excavation were made. Amateur antiquarians, drawn by the whispers of the haunted forest, began to dig near sites where villagers claimed to have seen bones surface. What they unearthed was more than mere fragments. Shallow graves, barely 2 feet deep, contained the remains of multiple children interred together. Some were infants, their bones scarcely formed. Others were adolescents, their teeth worn with early labor. In several pits, bodies had been arranged with strange deliberation, skulls clustered together, long bones stacked neatly, as though the burials followed some ritual, rather than the hurried work of desperation. Archaeologists, who later revisited these sites in the 20th century, were cautious in their conclusions. Radiocarbon dating placed many of the remains between the 16th and 18th centuries, the same period when famine, plague, and war ravaged the region. Yet the evidence resisted simple explanation. Some bones bore gnaw marks consistent with scavenging animals, which suggested exposure rather than proper burial. Others revealed perimortem fractures, broken bones inflicted at or near the time of death, that could not be explained by starvation alone. There are accounts, too, of objects buried with the children. A small wooden doll, its limbs crudely carved, found near the ribs of a girl no older than 6. A set of corroded iron charms, tucked beneath the jaw of another. In one site, fragments of cloth dyed a deep crimson lay beside a cluster of bones. Were these tokens of comfort, left by grieving families who could not face their guilt? Or were they offerings of another kind, signs of ritual, of attempts to ward off whatever the forest was believed to hold? The line between mourning and sacrifice, between burial and ritual, blurs here in unsettling ways. Forensic analysis deepens the unease. Many of the skeletons show signs of malnutrition, porous skulls from anemia, spines curved from rickets, teeth worn by grinding hunger. These were children who lived and died in hardship, their bodies bearing the testimony of suffering long before they entered the forest. Yet in some cases, trauma tells a different story. A few skulls exhibit sharp fractures consistent with blunt force. Some rib cages show clean breaks unlikely to have come from collapse or scavenging. These are marks of violence, whether from ritual killing, punishment, or the desperate cruelty of a collapsing world we cannot know. The arrangement of graves adds to the mystery. In some clearings, bodies appear to have been placed deliberately in circular patterns, as though the children had been gathered for something more than burial. In one excavation, the remains of at least 9 children were found around the base of a great oak, their small skeletons radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. No adult bones accompanied them. It is a sight that chills even hardened archaeologists, a scene that suggests not accident, not family burial, but something orchestrated, intentional, and yet, official reports on these discoveries remain curiously restrained. Many findings, particularly those of the mid-20th century, were filed away in archives with little publicity. Local authorities discouraged further excavations, citing respect for the dead or lack of resources. Some researchers whisper that the silence is deliberate, that the story of mass child burials near the Forest of Bones is too unsettling for public acknowledgement. Better, perhaps, to let the story remain folklore than to confront its grim materiality. Still, scattered details slip into the public record. In the 1960s, a team studying soil erosion reported uncovering a cluster of bones belonging to at least 4 children, all between the ages of 5 and 10. The remains bore no signs of coffin or shroud. Instead, they lay pressed together, their bones interlaced, as if they had died holding one another. A chilling image, children clinging to each other as their last defense against the darkness that surrounded them. In another report, unearthed in the 1980s, investigators noted strange discolorations in the soil near burial sites. Chemical analysis revealed unusually high concentrations of ash and charcoal, suggesting that fires had been lit around or even over the graves. Were these purification rites? Attempts to mask odor and disease, or darker still, remnants of rituals in which fire was part of the offering? The forest itself seems complicit in hiding and revealing these secrets. Its roots twist through the graves, disturbing bones, pulling them toward the surface only to bury them again with each passing season. Trees grow crooked over the sites, their trunks split and warped as though nourished by something unwholesome beneath. In this way, the land has become both witness and accomplice, preserving the memory of the children in forms that resist neat explanation. For those who have unearthed the bones, the experience is rarely clinical. Archaeologists speak of a heaviness in the air, of an unease that settles upon the dig like a weight. One researcher confessed that she refused to work alone in the forest after hearing what she swore were children's voices near dusk. Another reported recurring dreams of skeletal hands reaching up through the soil he had disturbed. Rational minds dismiss these as tricks of exhaustion and atmosphere, but they echo the villagers' warnings that the forest remembers, and that to disturb its graves is to invite its grief. So we are left with bones, silent but eloquent. They tell us of hunger, of suffering, of violence, and of ritual. They confirm that the story of the Forest of Bones is not only legend, yet they do not give us the final answer. They whisper fragments, leaving us to piece together a puzzle whose full image may never be known. Each discovery deepens the mystery rather than resolves it. For every child's skeleton unearthed, there are countless more still buried, countless more stories unspoken. The forest keeps them close, and even in death, the children remain what they always were, abandoned, forgotten, unnamed. Tragedy never remains only in silence. Over time, the weight of grief and horror reshapes itself into story, into legend, into whispers that pass from one generation to the next. The Forest of Bones, with its silent graves and scattered remains, was never remembered simply as a place of death. It became a place of myth, a landscape haunted not only by bones, but by the stories woven around them. And in those stories, the lost children lived again, not as they truly were, but as figures of caution, fear, and wonder. In the lullabies of the region, collected by folklorists in the 19th century, we hear the first echoes of this transformation. Mothers would sing to their children as night fell, their voices carrying warnings disguised as melodies. One haunting verse goes, "Close your eyes and do not roam. The forest calls its children home." At first it sounds like a simple admonition not to wander after dark, but the words carry a deeper weight. The forest itself is imagined as a living thing, a creature that remembers, that hungers, that seeks to reclaim the young. To sing such words to a child each night is to embed fear in their bones, a fear that reaches back centuries to when real children were never returned. Folk tales, too, give the story shape. Some tell of a witch who lived at the forest's heart, her hut built not of wood, but of bones. The children, left at the forest's edge, were drawn to her by hunger. She offered them food and warmth, but her kindness was a trap. In these tales, the witch fed upon them slowly, keeping their souls bound to the trees. The story is disturbingly similar to the German tale of Hansel and Gretel, but older versions in this region lack the happy ending. There is no escape, no clever trick to burn the witch. The children are swallowed by the forest and never return. Other stories shift the blame away from witches and toward the forest itself. Here the woods are not a backdrop, but an entity. The trees are said to whisper names, luring children deeper until they vanish among the roots. In some villages, parents told their children that the forest was the dwelling of ancient spirits, guardians of the land angered by human greed. The abandoned children were seen as tribute, an appeasement offered in exchange for the survival of the village. If crops grew and plague passed, it was because the forest had been fed. This interpretation is chilling, for it suggests not only abandonment but ritual, that communities may have convinced themselves the sacrifice was necessary, even sacred. Legends collected in the early 20th century speak of the bone circle. Elders described a hidden clearing, where the earth itself is white, littered with fragments of bone that rise to the surface after rain. Children who stray too close, the stories say, hear voices calling their names. If they answer, even with a whisper, they are doomed to wander until they vanish. This motif, the call of the dead, appears again and again, a folkloric device used to instill terror, but perhaps rooted in real memories of children who once called out for their parents, unheard. Not all tales were warnings. Some carried a grim kind of reverence. In one story, the lost children are transformed into pale lights, will-o'-the-wisps that flicker between the trees. These lights, villagers said, could guide lost travelers to safety or lure them deeper into danger, depending on whether the children's spirits sought mercy or vengeance. The duality of the tale mirrors the duality of memory itself, compassion for the victims, but fear of the restless dead. Even rituals grew around the legend. In some villages, when a child died young, families would leave a toy, a ribbon, or a lock of hair at the forest's edge. These offerings were not meant for their own child, but for the others, the forsaken ones. The belief was that such gifts would soothe the lost, preventing them from haunting the living. To this day, hikers report finding such objects deep within the forest: tiny shoes, hand-carved dolls, faded ribbons tied around branches. Whether left by grieving families, curious visitors, or locals continuing an old tradition, they add to the sense that the forest is not merely a place of nature, but of memory and ritual. The myth also seeped into morality tales. Parents told children that the forest punished disobedience. If they lied, stole, or wandered too far, the forsaken children would come for them at night, pale hands reaching from the trees. These tales reinforced obedience, but they also kept alive the memory of abandonment. Every child who grew up under such warnings carried within them a piece of the old fear, passing it on when they became parents themselves. What makes these stories especially haunting is how they mirror real fears. In times of famine, parents may indeed have whispered to their children, "Stay close, or the forest will take you." The metaphor would have felt literal, for those who strayed too far often never returned. Over time, the warning ceased to be practical and became supernatural, until the line between reality and legend was erased. As the centuries passed, the legend of the Forest of Bones became less a story of abandonment and more a story of haunting. The children were no longer remembered as victims of famine or fear, but as restless spirits bound to the land. This transformation tells us much about the human need to mythologize tragedy. When horror is too great to face directly, we turn it into story. We give it shape, even monstrous shape, so that it can be told. To say that children were abandoned by their own families is unbearable. To say they were taken by witches, by spirits, by the forest itself, allows the community to survive the memory without drowning in its guilt. And so the children were reborn in legend, as pale lights, as voices in the wind, as bone-white trees that seemed to bend and whisper. They were no longer individuals but archetypes, warnings etched into lullabies, tales told by firelight, specters glimpsed at the edge of vision. History reduced them to bones. Folklore gave them back their voices, but voices that speak not of who they were, but of what they became in the imagination of those who could not bear to remember the truth. The Forest of Bones, then, is not only a graveyard, it is a storybook written in soil and silence, its pages turned by centuries of fear. The children live on within it, not as they were, but as shadows, myths and warnings, forever bound to the trees that watched them vanish. By the 17th century, the forest's reputation had grown from a whisper to a wound. It was no longer simply a place of sorrow or famine. It had become a site of suspicion, where every unexplained disappearance fed into a larger paranoia. And in an age when plague, hunger and war constantly thinned the population, such paranoia had only one natural outlet. The witch trials swept across Europe like wildfire during this period, fueled by fear of the unknown and the desperation to assign blame. Entire communities turned against themselves, accusing neighbors of dark pacts and unspeakable rituals. And in the villages bordering the Forest of Bones, the accusations took on a particular flavor. Where other towns whispered of curses upon cattle, hexes upon crops, or storms summoned by malice, here the cry was different. Here the accusation was always the same. They are taking the children. The archival fragments that survive paint a chilling picture. In 1624, a record from a trial in a nearby town details the testimony of a woman accused of leading children into the woods. She was said to have sung to them in a language no one understood, promising them bread, honey, and warmth. Witnesses claimed she was seen with a procession of children walking beneath the trees at dusk, children who were never seen again. Under torture, she confessed, though her words were incoherent, describing visions of spirits with hollow eyes and roots for fingers. She was burned at the stake within weeks. Whether she was guilty of anything but being feared is unlikely to ever be known. Other testimonies tell similar tales. In 1649, 3 sisters were accused of binding the souls of children to the forest. Villagers claimed that the sisters were seen at night carrying bundles into the woods, bundles that moved and whimpered like infants. When their home was searched, investigators found crude charms made of twigs, bones, and cloth. The sisters denied everything, but the evidence was interpreted through the lens of hysteria. They were hanged before a crowd of hundreds. No bodies of children were recovered, but the villagers left convinced that justice had been served. What is striking in these accounts is how often the forest itself is invoked. In one surviving deposition, a witness claimed, "She called to the trees and the trees answered." In another, The children's voices were heard after the bells rang for supper, though no children were in sight. Again and again, the line between witch and wood blurs, as though the forest required human agents to enact its will. To blame a witch was, in a sense, to blame the land itself, but with the comfort of believing the evil could be rooted out and destroyed. And yet, beneath the hysteria, some darker truths may hide. While many trials were surely fabrications born of fear, there are hints that practices of sacrifice, ritual, or appeasement were not entirely invented. Folklorists and historians note that certain charms described in trial records, bundles of hair, small effigies bound with string, offerings of food left in hollow trees are consistent with older pagan customs. What may have been once intended as harmless rites to ensure fertility or ward off disease became, under the eyes of zealous inquisitors, evidence of devil worship. The children, in these narratives, occupy the most fragile place. They are both victims and vessels, innocents who vanish, but also figures through whom communities project their deepest fears. When a child disappeared into the forest, whether by accident, abandonment, or malice, the explanation was almost always supernatural. A wolf could be blamed, or hunger, but these were not satisfying. Far easier to believe the child had been taken, stolen by witches who fattened themselves on youthful souls. Such a belief simultaneously explained tragedy and justified vengeance. One of the most unsettling trial fragments comes from 1672. A woman known only as Marta was accused of consorting with forest spirits. Under interrogation, she admitted to leaving her own stillborn child at the forest's edge as an offering. She believed, she said, that doing so would spare her living children from famine. "The forest takes what it is owed," she whispered, according to the scribe's notes. The court branded this as devilry, and Marta was executed. Yet her confession reveals something deeper: the persistence of an older belief system in which sacrifice was not crime but necessity. Whether real or imagined, such practices suggest that the boundary between survival and superstition was thin indeed. By the 18th century, the witch hunts began to fade, but the damage was lasting. The executions did not end the disappearances, nor did they calm the forest's reputation. Instead, they deepened the association between the woods and blood sacrifice. In the minds of villagers, the witches may have been destroyed, but the children's voices remained. People spoke of hearing laughter at twilight, of finding tiny handprints pressed into the bark of trees, of dreams in which pale figures stood at their bedside, beckoning them toward the forest path. What is remarkable is how these stories endured even after the age of reason began to erode belief in witches. Enlightenment thinkers scoffed at charms and trials, but even they struggled to dismiss the forest's aura. In 1791, a traveling physician wrote in his journal that he had visited the site of the so-called witches' graves near the woods. He described a profound unease that came over him. "It is as though the air itself remembers the cries of children. Reason tells me I am foolish, yet instinct demands I leave at once." And so the witchcraft narratives remained alive, not because of ongoing accusations, but because they had fused with the identity of the forest itself. Witches, children, and bones had become inseparable in the popular imagination. The executions had not destroyed the myth. They had strengthened it, anchoring it in real blood and public memory. The witch trials also provided something more insidious, a way for the community to externalize its guilt. If children vanished in the woods, it was not because parents abandoned them, nor because famine forced impossible choices. No. Far easier to say that witches lured them, that the devil claimed them, that evil came from outside. This psychological alchemy allowed the community to survive its own sins, to point the finger outward rather than inward. The cost of this absolution was the lives of women, poor, widowed, eccentric, or simply disliked, who became the scapegoats of grief. When we trace these stories back through time, we find that the Forest of Bones is more than a landscape. It is a crucible in which fear, hunger, and guilt combine to create monsters. Whether or not witches ever performed rituals in the forest, the people believed they did, and belief is often more powerful and more enduring than truth. Thus the legend evolved. The forest was no longer just a grave but an altar. The bones of children were not merely evidence of tragedy, but proof of ritual sacrifice and devilry. The witches may have been burned, but their shadows lingered, walking still between the trees, hand in hand with the abandoned children who never left. The past, they say, never truly dies. In the forest of bones, it lingers like a chill in the air, pressing against the skin, whispering at the edge of hearing. For centuries, the place was spoken of in hushed tones, its horrors remembered through lullabies and legends. But in the last 100 years, as belief in witches faded and science sought to explain away superstition, a new form of testimony began to take root. Accounts of direct encounters with the inexplicable. And unlike folklore, these were not tales told by ancestors long dead. These were experiences reported by men and women still alive to tell them, their voices trembling as they recalled what they had seen. The earliest modern accounts date back to the late 19th century, when the romantic fascination with ruins and haunted landscapes was at its peak. Travelers drawn to the forest in search of eerie beauty often returned shaken. In 1893, a German writer described his visit in a letter later published in a literary magazine. At twilight, the air grew thick, as if it was smoke, though no fire burned. I heard laughter, children's laughter, though I was quite alone. It seemed to circle me, darting between the trees, always behind me, never before me. I left quickly, and did not return. His words were dismissed as embellishment, but others soon echoed them. By the early 20th century, local newspapers began to report stories of hikers who vanished in the woods. Some were found days later, dazed and unable to explain where they had been. One young man, recovered in 1927 after being missing for 4 days, claimed he had followed the sound of a child crying. Each time he drew near, the voice moved further away, until at last he found himself lost. He remembered little after that, only that he felt small hands pulling at his coat, guiding him deeper into the dark. It was in the post-war years, however, that the forest's reputation as a site of haunting crystallized. Soldiers returning from the Second World War passed through the region, many camping in the woods on their way home. Several spoke of seeing pale figures between the trees, children, always children, their faces indistinct, their bodies half translucent in the moonlight. Some soldiers swore they heard choruses of voices singing lullabies in languages they did not know. Others reported dreams so vivid that they awoke with scratches on their arms and dirt beneath their fingernails, as if they had been walking in their sleep. By the 1960s and 70s, with the rise of paranormal research groups, the Forest of Bones became a magnet for ghost hunters. Armed with tape recorders and crude electromagnetic devices, investigators sought to capture proof of the supernatural. Some of their findings remain chilling. In 1972, a group from Prague recorded what they believed to be electronic voice phenomena, faint but distinct whispers on tape that were not audible at the time of recording. When played back, the voices seemed to repeat a single word in a child's tone. Matka, mother. The investigators left the site shaken and did not return. Photographs, too, began to circulate. Tourists snapped images of the forest paths, only to discover upon development ghostly shapes in the background, figures that resembled children, standing still watching. In some cases, the faces appeared blurred, elongated, or missing altogether, adding to the sense of unease. Skeptics dismiss such images as tricks of light, double exposures, or the human brain's tendency to find faces in random shapes. Yet for those who captured the images, the experience was rarely comforting. Local witnesses offer stories more visceral still. One elderly woman, interviewed in the 1980s, claimed that when she was a child, her father forbade her from playing near the forest's edge. She disobeyed once, chasing after a ball, and swore that she saw a girl standing beneath the trees. The girl was her age, wearing a ragged dress, her skin so pale it seemed almost luminous. She beckoned silently, but when the witness tried to approach, her father grabbed her and pulled her away. "You must never answer them," he told her. "If you do, they will take you." She carried that warning into adulthood, her voice trembling as she recounted it decades later. Stranger still, are reports of physical sensations. Hikers have spoken of sudden drops in temperature, as though they had stepped into an invisible pocket of ice. Others describe overwhelming waves of sorrow, despair so heavy it brings them to tears without cause. Some report feeling watched, followed, even touched, light brushes against their hands, or the tug of unseen fingers on their clothes. In a few rare cases, visitors have emerged with scratches or bruises they cannot explain, marks they insist were not present when they entered the forest. Skeptics argue, of course, that the mind is vulnerable in such environments. Dense forests can disorient, shadows can deceive, the natural creaks and groans of trees in the wind can mimic whispers. But even skeptics admit that the consistency of certain details, children's voices, laughter, pale figures across decades of testimony is difficult to dismiss entirely. Too many accounts, from too many different people, echo the same themes. The advent of the internet in the late 20th century brought a flood of new stories. Forums and paranormal websites carry countless accounts from modern-day visitors. Some claim to have captured ghostly orbs on video. Others insist they heard nursery rhymes sung faintly in the dark. A few recount being led in circles, walking for hours only to find themselves back at the same spot, as though the forest itself were reshaping to trap them. Perhaps most chilling are the accounts of children. Parents report that their young sons or daughters sometimes speak of friends they met in the woods, pale, quiet friends who asked them to play. One family recounted how their daughter returned from a hike with a doll she swore had been given to her by another child. The doll was examined by experts and found to be handmade, fashioned in a style common centuries ago. How such an object ended up in the hands of a modern child remains unanswered. Paranormal investigators continue to probe the forest today, using thermal cameras, sensitive audio equipment, and motion detectors. Some claim to have recorded heat signatures in the shape of small bodies darting between trees. Others have captured high-pitched cries, muffled sobs or giggles impossible to attribute to wildlife. Few spend more than a night in the forest. The atmosphere, they say, becomes unbearable after sundown, as if the air itself grows heavier with each passing hour. And so the Forest of Bones remains what it has always been, a threshold between history and haunting, between tragedy and terror. For some, the modern accounts are proof that the children never left, their spirits bound to the soil where their bodies were abandoned. For others, the stories are echoes of guilt and fear passed down so strongly through generations that the land itself seems to breathe them back. Whether ghost, legend, or trick of the mind, the experience is always the same, the feeling of not being alone. The laughter that should bring joy instead chills the blood. The cry of a child, once a call for comfort, becomes an invitation to vanish. And those who enter the Forest of Bones today step not only into a landscape of trees and earth, but into the presence of all who were lost there, still waiting, still reaching, still unseen. Every legend, no matter how deeply it haunts, eventually attracts the scrutiny of science. The Forest of Bones is no exception. For centuries, its reputation was sustained by whispers, superstitions, and chilling testimonies. But in the modern era, when folklore is often met with skepticism, investigators from fields as diverse as archaeology, anthropology, geology, and psychology have sought to uncover what lies beneath the myth. Their goal to separate the tangible from the spectral, to determine whether the forest's mysteries are born of something beyond the natural or entirely within it. The first serious scientific inquiries began in the late 19th century. Archaeologists, intrigued by villagers' claims of skeletal remains surfacing after heavy rains, conducted surveys of the forest floor. Their findings confirmed at least part of the legend. Human bones were present in surprising numbers. Excavations revealed clusters of child remains, many shallowly buried, with little evidence of coffins or formal rites. The bones often showed signs of malnutrition, disease, or neglect. Scholars at the time concluded that the Forest of Bones was not supernatural at all, but simply a site of historical tragedy, a place where famine-ravaged communities abandoned their weakest members. Yet even as these explanations satisfied some, they raised further questions. Why were so many burials so haphazard? Why were children's remains clustered apart from adults? And what of the peculiar arrangements, circular patterns, stacked bones or objects interred with the bodies that suggested ritual? Some scholars argued that these were vestiges of folk customs, ancient ways of coping with loss or attempting to ward off evil. Others proposed something darker, that the remains pointed not only to abandonment but to sacrifice, acts performed in desperation when ordinary survival strategies had failed. In the 20th century, as forensic science advanced, researchers revisited the remains with new tools. Radiocarbon dating confirmed that most of the bones dated from the 16th to 18th centuries, aligning with periods of repeated famine in the region. Isotope analysis revealed nutritional deficiencies consistent with prolonged hunger, lending weight to the abandonment theory. Yet forensic examinations also uncovered anomalies, fractures that suggested violence, burn marks on bones that hinted at fire rituals, and soil residues containing unusually high levels of ash. These findings did not confirm sacrifice, but they did not rule it out either. The line between desperate survival and ritualistic offering remained blurred. Geologists too turned their attention to the forest. They discovered that the area is prone to natural disorientation. Magnetic anomalies caused by iron-rich deposits in the soil may interfere with compasses, leading travelers in circles. The dense tree cover muffles sound, creating the illusion that noises like footsteps or laughter are closer or further away than they really are. Some researchers argue that many reported supernatural encounters can be explained by these environmental quirks: lights mistaken for reflections, voices distorted by acoustics, feelings of being followed amplified by the uncanny stillness of the forest. Psychologists approach the mystery from another angle: the human mind itself. The forest of bones, they argue, is a place already weighted with centuries of fear and folklore. Visitors enter expecting unease, primed to interpret ordinary sensations as extraordinary. In such heightened states, the brain becomes vulnerable to pareidolia, the tendency to see faces in patterns, to hear voices in random noise, to impose meaning on ambiguity. A gust of wind becomes a whisper, a flicker of moonlight becomes a ghostly figure. Once one detail is perceived as supernatural, the rest of the experience cascades into confirmation. In this way, the forest's reputation sustains itself, not because of external forces, but because of the human mind's deep susceptibility to fear. Yet for all these rational explanations, anomalies persist. Modern archaeological teams have uncovered evidence that refuses to be easily filed away. For example, a 1994 excavation revealed the remains of at least 7 children buried around the roots of a single oak tree. Their arrangement was deliberate, radiating outward like spokes of a wheel. No adult remains were present. The team proposed that this could have been a form of symbolic burial, but they could not explain why it involved only children, or why the pattern matched ritualistic motifs found in unrelated cultures. Another puzzling discovery came in 2007, when ground-penetrating radar revealed dozens of anomalies beneath the soil, cavities resembling mass graves, many still unexcavated. Local authorities halted further digs, citing respect for the dead and ecological preservation. But researchers privately admitted the frustration of leaving so many unanswered questions beneath the earth. Were these cavities further proof of famine burials, or something more organized, more sinister? Without excavation, the truth remains buried. Literally. Skeptics also struggle to account for the sheer consistency of eyewitness testimony. The descriptions of children's voices, laughter and pale figures recur too often across centuries to be dismissed entirely as coincidence. Even when stripped of embellishment, the overlap is striking. Psychologists suggest this is the power of cultural inheritance. Stories of the lost children are so deeply embedded in the collective memory that each generation unconsciously repeats them. But believers argue that such persistence hints at something more, that the forest itself holds a memory, replaying fragments of its past for those who dare to enter. There is also the matter of objects found within the forest. Hikers have reported discovering centuries-old dolls, ribbons or trinkets lying in places where no known burials exist. Some of these objects have been authenticated as historically accurate, consistent with artifacts from the 17th century. How they came to rest in the open, preserved in relatively good condition, remains puzzling. Rational explanations point to soil erosion and animal disturbance bringing old objects to the surface. Paranormal enthusiasts counter that these are gifts left by the children themselves, relics from beyond the grave. At the core of the scientific debate is a single uncomfortable truth: explanations abound, but certainty does not. For every rational theory, there is an unanswered anomaly. For every forensic conclusion, there is evidence that resists tidy categorization. The Forest of Bones remains both a site of tangible tragedy and intangible dread. Its bones testify to real suffering, its folklore to real fear. And perhaps it is the collision of these two realms, history and haunting, that makes the mystery so enduring. The rationalists insist that the forest's horrors can be explained: famine, abandonment, magnetic anomalies, psychological suggestion, yet even they admit that stepping beneath its canopy carries an unease that logic cannot dispel. Science can account for bones and soil, for malnutrition and erosion, for pareidolia and fear, but can it account for the laughter heard where no child stands? Can it explain the dreamlike voices caught on tape, whispering words of grief in long-dead languages? In the end, the scientific investigations do not dissolve the legend, they sharpen it. By confirming the reality of bones beneath the soil, they give weight to the myth. By revealing anomalies, they leave space for the supernatural. The Forest of Bones resists resolution, existing in that liminal space where archaeology touches folklore, where rational inquiry collides with irrational dread. And it is in that collision that the forest's true power lies, not in answers, but in the questions that linger when reason has spoken and unease remains. The Forest of Bones is not a relic of the past. For those who live in its shadow, the legend is not merely something told in hushed tones by the fire. It is an active presence, shaping daily life in quiet but unmistakable ways. To outsiders, it may seem like superstition, charming, or unsettling fragments of folklore preserved for tourists. But to the locals, the rituals surrounding the forest are neither quaint nor symbolic. They are essential, protective gestures passed down across generations, rooted in the conviction that the forest remembers. Travelers who pass through the nearby villages often remark on a strange absence. Children are rarely seen playing near the tree line, even in daylight. Parents are cautious, watchful, their warnings sharper than one might expect in otherwise quiet rural communities. Don't wander too close, they tell their children. Don't answer if you hear your name. These admonitions, repeated for centuries, have hardened into rules that no one dares test. For in these villages, the old stories are not dismissed. They are lived. One of the most persistent customs is the leaving of offerings. At the forest's edge, small objects can be found even today: toys, coins, ribbons, and sweets placed carefully at the roots of trees. Some are left by grieving parents who lost children to sickness or accident, gifts meant to comfort the forsaken children of legend, so they will not envy or harm the living. Others are tokens of appeasement, meant to ensure safe passage through the forest for hunters, loggers, or travelers. The practice is so common that the offerings blend seamlessly into the landscape. A faded doll with missing eyes, a rusting tin whistle, a bundle of wildflowers tied with string. To outsiders, they may look like litter. To locals, they are contracts. It is said that to take an offering from the forest is to invite disaster. There are tales of tourists who pocketed a ribbon or charm, only to suffer sudden illness, accidents, or unshakable nightmares upon returning home. In one account, a man visiting from the city picked up a small wooden figurine carved in the shape of a child. He joked that it would make a curious souvenir. Days later, he was hospitalized after a fall that doctors could not fully explain. His family insisted that he returned the figurine to the forest once he recovered, though whether the act brought him peace is unknown. Another enduring custom involves sound. Locals warn against speaking a child's name aloud within the forest. To do so, they believe, is to invite the attention of the forsaken children. The spirits, they say, hunger for names, for the warmth of being recognized. Once they hear one, they may cling to it, following the living child back home, whispering until the bond becomes unbreakable. Some families go further still, refusing to speak children's names at all near the forest's edge, referring to them instead with nicknames or titles: little one, my son, the girl. Names, after all, are power. Bonfires are another tradition, though their meaning is more complex. At midsummer, villagers gather at safe clearings outside the forest to build large fires. They sing, dance, and drink. But beneath the festivity lies a darker purpose. The fire, they say, keeps the spirits at bay, driving back the shadows and sealing the boundary between the living and the dead. Some communities throw into the flames small tokens belonging to children: hair clippings, broken toys, even teeth lost in youth. These sacrifices, minor though they may seem, are acts of protection, ensuring that the forsaken children remain within their forest and do not cross into the homes of the living. There are also taboos about entering the forest at certain times. Dusk is considered dangerous, for it is the hour when day and night balance uneasily, and the spirits of the children are said to stir. Midnight too is forbidden, though for different reasons. It is the hour when the forest is believed to speak whispering secrets to those who listen. Pregnant women are especially cautioned against venturing near, for the forest is said to crave new life to replace what it lost. Even today, some mothers avoid walking near the tree line during pregnancy, preferring to take longer routes around rather than risk unseen attention. In some households, families still maintain small protective charms: bundles of herbs hung above doors, carved symbols etched into the wood of cradles. These are not openly acknowledged as wards against the forest of bones, but when asked directly, older residents will nod and say, "It is better to be safe." Such charms often contain rowan, juniper, or iron, plants and metals traditionally associated with protection against restless spirits. Their quiet presence speaks to a lingering fear that no modern explanation has managed to erase. The silence around the forest is itself a kind of ritual. Questions about it are often met with evasive answers. Elders especially grow tense when pressed. To speak too much of the forest is, in their eyes, to invite its gaze. Some things are not meant to be told, one villager said to a folklorist in the 1970s, closing the door firmly after the remark. Outsiders may interpret this as secrecy or stubbornness, but for the villagers, it is survival. The forest thrives on attention. They believe to feed it with stories is to strengthen its grip. And yet, despite these fears, the forest also carries a paradoxical reverence. In a strange way, it has become both feared and sacred. Locals speak of it with dread, but also with a certain respect, as one might speak of an old, dangerous god. It is not a place to be conquered or dismissed, but one to be acknowledged, placated, endured. This reverence, though born of horror, has preserved the forest in ways modern conservationists might envy. Few dare to cut its trees. Few dare to alter its shape, and so it remains untouched, an ancient wound held open by ritual fear. Tourists who stumble upon these customs often mistake them for quaint relics of folklore, little more than curiosities for guidebooks. But those who stay long enough sense the deeper truth, that for the locals, the forest of bones is still alive. It is not simply a tale to tell children, nor a legend for outsiders to marvel at. It is a reality that shapes how they live, how they speak, how they protect what they love. Their rituals are not performed for spectacle, they are performed because deep down the villagers believe they must be. In the end, these taboos and offerings, silences and bonfires, stand as proof that the forest's past has never fully passed. Its tragedy is not confined to bones beneath the soil or tales in dusty archives. It lingers in the present, encoded in gestures so small they might be overlooked, yet powerful enough to shape lives. The forest of bones in this way is not just a place of death, it is a place of memory, one that demands reverence, fear, and ritual from those who dwell in its shadow. In recent decades, the forest of bones has not remained only the concern of villagers and folklorists. Its reputation has spread far beyond its borders, drawing in researchers, thrill seekers, and paranormal investigators armed with technology that promises to pierce the veil between superstition and fact. To them, the forest is more than a story. It is a challenge, a puzzle to be unraveled, a mystery that can be solved with the right tools. But time and again, those who enter return with more questions than answers. Some bring with them footage, photographs, and recordings that defy explanation. Others bring only silence, choosing never to speak of what they witnessed inside. One of the earliest organized expeditions took place in the late 1980s, when a university anthropology team, curious about the enduring folklore, sought to document both the cultural traditions surrounding the forest and the physical environment itself. They brought with them cameras, notebooks, compasses, and equipment to take soil and bone samples. For 3 days they camped near the forest's edge, venturing deeper each morning. Their journals reveal a strange pattern. The further they went, the more disoriented they became. Trails they had carefully marked the day before seemed to vanish. Compass needles spun erratically. More than once, members of the team reported hearing voices calling their names. At first, these were dismissed as tricks of the ear. By the 3rd day, the researchers grew uneasy. That night, their journals note a sound that several of them heard at once, the distinct echo of children laughing, carried across the trees. They packed up the next morning, citing environmental instability as the reason. None of them published their findings. In the 1990s and 2000s, the rise of paranormal investigation shows brought new waves of attention to the Forest of Bones. Crews armed with infrared cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and digital recorders entered, promising to capture definitive proof of the supernatural. Most episodes followed a predictable pattern: long stretches of silence punctuated by sudden noises, flickers of light or cold spots. Skeptics dismissed these as coincidences, products of faulty equipment, or overactive imagination. But one recording from a 2002 investigation continues to circulate in hushed forums even today. The team had left digital recorders running overnight at several points in the forest. When they retrieved the devices, most captured nothing but wind and distant animal calls. But one recorder, placed at the base of an ancient oak, contained something chilling. For nearly 2 minutes, faint voices can be heard, high-pitched, overlapping, speaking in what sounds like a mixture of laughter and song. Audio specialists analyzed the clip and found no evidence of tampering. Yet the most unsettling detail is what happens near the end. A voice, clearer than the rest, whispers a single word. Transcriptions vary, but many believe it to be a name, perhaps the name of one of the investigators themselves. Such recordings are not isolated. In 2011, a small team of independent investigators entered with modern EVP, electronic voice phenomenon devices, deliberately asking questions aloud. Who are you? Why are you here? What happened to you? For the most part, the devices picked up only static. But in one instance, when asked, "Do you want us to leave?" a faint but distinct childlike voice replied, "Stay." The investigators left the forest that very night, shaken. Not all expeditions end with eerie recordings. Some end with fear of a more primal kind. In 2016, a group of hikers who set out to film their own documentary found themselves lost within hours, despite using GPS. They reported walking in circles, returning repeatedly to the same clearing where they had set up camp. By the 2nd day, tempers frayed. They claimed to hear footsteps trailing behind them at night, though their lights revealed nothing. When they finally emerged, exhausted and shaken, they abandoned their project entirely. The footage they released publicly shows little beyond endless trees and anxious faces. Yet among those who have seen the unreleased material, rumors persist of something more: flickering shapes caught at the edge of light, shadows that seem too small to belong to adults. Even more unsettling are the accounts of investigators who refuse to speak at all. One seasoned paranormal researcher, known for tackling infamous sites around the world, entered the Forest of Bones in 2019 with a small team. They spent 2 nights inside. When they emerged, he announced he would never return, and he never again investigated another location. He gave no interviews, no reports, no explanations. His silence has become its own kind of testimony, sparking speculation about what he encountered that broke even his hardened resolve. Yet perhaps the most haunting modern account comes not from seasoned investigators, but from a pair of amateur filmmakers who entered in 2021 with a simple handheld camera. They live-streamed their journey online, chatting casually with viewers as they walked deeper into the forest. For hours, nothing occurred, just trees, roots, and occasional laughter between the two friends. Then, near dusk, the camera captured something faint but unmistakable: a small figure darting between the trees, pale against the shadows. The filmmakers froze. One whispered, "Did you see that?" The stream cut abruptly minutes later. Neither filmmaker has publicly spoken about what happened next, and though they are alive, their channel was abandoned entirely. To this day, viewers argue over whether the figure was a trick of light, a hoax, or something far more unsettling. Despite these unnerving accounts, expeditions continue. Scientists, thrill seekers and believers alike cannot resist the allure of the Forest of Bones. It represents the ultimate test, a chance to capture proof of either human tragedy lingering in the soil, or of something that transcends explanation. Each investigation adds to the archive of fragments, voices, images, whispers, but never delivers final answers. For every team that emerges shaken, another enters, convinced that this time they will find the truth. And yet, the forest remains undefeated. Its shadows seem to swallow certainty. Its silence resists analysis, whether through lost time, inexplicable sounds, or the oppressive weight of its atmosphere. The Forest of Bones ensures that no one who enters leaves untouched. The recordings, the testimonies, the abandoned projects, each is another thread in its tapestry of dread. For the locals, these expeditions change nothing. They shake their heads at outsiders who think they can capture the forest with machines and lenses. The children don't want to be found, one villager remarked. They want to be remembered. There's a difference. Perhaps that is the key. The forest is not a puzzle to be solved, but a wound to be acknowledged, a grief that demands reverence rather than resolution. Still, the lure remains. Each new piece of evidence, each chilling recording, each unanswered disappearance ensures that the Forest of Bones continues to call to those who seek the truth, and just as surely, it continues to claim them, not always with death, but with silence, fear, and unanswered questions. In this way, the modern investigations mirror the old stories. Those who go in often return different, carrying something back with them, something unseen but undeniable. What happens inside the Forest of Bones is unsettling, but what happens after may be worse. For many, the true terror does not begin until they leave the trees behind. The forest seems to linger, not in body but in mind, attaching itself to memory, gnawing at sanity, whispering across the fragile line between waking and sleep. Those who dare to enter often describe the same unsettling phenomenon. The forest follows them home. It begins innocuously enough. Investigators, hikers, even casual visitors report vivid dreams within days of leaving. The dreams are nearly always the same. A clearing, a ring of trees, and in the shadows, children, dozens of them standing silently, their faces pale and indistinct. Sometimes they only watch. Sometimes they whisper. Sometimes they reach out their hands, inviting the dreamer to follow. These visions are so consistent across testimonies that psychologists studying the phenomenon coined a term, the bone forest dream. Its uncanny repetition suggests either a collective hallucination or something deeper, a shared imprint left by the forest on every mind that crosses its threshold. But dreams are only the beginning. Sleep itself becomes difficult. Survivors of expeditions report waking in the night to the sound of laughter just outside their homes. Laughter, they insist, is the same they heard in the woods. Others claim to hear footsteps in their hallways, light and quick, like those of a child. A few have reported the smell of damp earth clinging to their rooms, the same scent that saturates the soil of the forest floor. The terror lies not in these sensations alone, but in their persistence. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months, and still, the forest finds a way to return. Relationships, too, often fracture under the weight of these hauntings. Family members describe once rational loved ones growing distant, restless, consumed by obsession. Some spend hours re-watching their own footage, convinced they will find something hidden in the static. Others refuse to speak of the forest at all, insisting that silence is the only protection. Marriages strain, friendships dissolve, and in some cases, investigators abandon their work altogether, unable to return to the field after what they endured. The forest does not merely haunt individuals, it corrodes the connections around them, isolating them in their dread. The most disturbing accounts, however, come from those who claim the forest does more than haunt. It claims a handful of cases exist where individuals who entered the Forest of Bones later disappeared entirely, not within its borders but far from them. One young man, who had joined a 2005 investigation, was last seen walking into a park near his city home. His belongings were found on a bench, neatly arranged. He was never seen again. Another case involved a woman who returned from the forest, shaken but physically unharmed. She later told friends she felt watched constantly, even in her apartment. Weeks later she vanished. The only trace left behind was a small handprint, smeared in mud across her window pane. Skeptics argue these are coincidences, disappearances no different from countless others. Yet for those who knew the missing, the pattern is unmistakable. They believe the forest marked them, attached itself like a shadow, and eventually pulled them back. The children left behind in the forest, it seems, may not be content to remain alone. Psychologists who have studied these aftermaths propose explanations rooted in trauma. The forest, with its oppressive silence and disorienting terrain, induces heightened anxiety. This state, combined with the weight of folklore and expectation, imprints itself so deeply that the mind continues to replay it long after leaving. Nightmares, paranoia, auditory hallucinations, all are consistent with post-traumatic stress. In this view, the forest is not supernatural at all, but simply an environment uniquely designed to fracture the human psyche. But even the psychologists admit to anomalies they cannot fully explain. Why, for instance, do so many visitors report the same dream, often in strikingly similar detail, despite never having heard of it beforehand? Why do EVPs recorded inside the forest sometimes match the whispers heard later in victims' homes? Why do investigators who return to the forest more than once claim that the hauntings intensify each time, as though the bond deepens with exposure? These questions blur the line between science and the inexplicable. There are also cultural interpretations of this aftermath, shaped by local belief. Villagers insist the forest does not merely frighten, it attaches. They speak of a mark placed on those who cross the threshold, a mark invisible but undeniable. Once marked, the person becomes vulnerable to the call of the children. The only protection, they say, is ritual cleansing, fire, salt, or prayers spoken by elders. Outsiders rarely seek such help, dismissing it as superstition. And yet, among those who do, some report their nightmares ceasing abruptly afterward. Coincidence, suggestion, or something more? What is certain is that the forest exerts a psychological toll far beyond its borders. Investigators who return often speak of losing time, not just in the forest but afterward. They describe staring at walls for hours, unable to recall what they were thinking. They recount hearing faint voices even in crowds, whispers that seem to curl between conversations. A few admit to being drawn back against their will, compelled to return despite the fear. It doesn't let you go, one survivor confessed. It waits, it watches, and eventually you start to wonder if you belong to it now. Perhaps this is the truest horror of the Forest of Bones. Not the bones beneath the soil, not the whispers in the dark, but the way it takes root inside the human mind, growing like ivy, spreading until it cannot be separated from thought itself. You may leave the forest, but the forest does not leave you. In this way, the legend of the children left behind achieves a cruel immortality. They were forsaken once, left to the shadows of the trees. Now, they return, not in flesh but in memory, hitching themselves to the minds of those who wander too close. Their laughter echoes not only among the branches, but in bedrooms, hallways, and dreams. Their presence is not confined to place, but to the fragile boundary between fear and sanity. And perhaps that is the most terrifying truth. The Forest of Bones is not just a location, it is an infection of the imagination, a haunting that seeps into those who dare to touch it. To hear their voices is to carry them. To dream their faces is to remember them, and to remember them is to risk becoming one of them, another lost soul in the endless chorus of children left behind. There comes a point in every investigation where the pursuit of answers becomes its own labyrinth. The deeper one searches into the forest of bones, the more elusive the truth becomes, slipping through fingers like mist. What began as a question of history, what happened to the children left behind, has unfolded into something larger, something that refuses to be contained by fact alone. Bones tell one story, folklore tells another. The voices, the dreams, the rituals, the disappearances, they tell something else entirely. And in the clash between these narratives lies the forest's enduring power. On the surface, one explanation is simple enough. The bones belong to children abandoned during times of famine and plague. Poverty drove families to choices so desperate they cannot be fully judged by modern eyes. The forest became their graveyard, their silence echoing down the centuries. In this light, the legend is a warning, a reflection of humanity's darkest hour. What happens when despair overrides compassion? The children's voices that people claim to hear are nothing more than echoes of guilt carried through folklore, the human need to remember what should never have been forgotten. Yet the simplicity falters upon closer inspection. Archaeological patterns, inexplicable arrangements, recurring visions, persistent dreams, these suggest something more than memory. Something lingers here, something that resists being buried. If the forest holds not only bones but consciousness, then it is not simply a graveyard, it is a sanctuary of the lost, a place where abandoned souls remain, forever calling, forever waiting. To step into the forest is to step into their grief. To leave it is to carry a fragment of that grief away. The truth may lie not in choosing between these explanations, but in recognizing their entanglement. History births folklore, folklore feeds haunting, haunting ensures remembrance. The forest of bones becomes less a place and more a cycle, a machine of memory, designed to ensure the forsaken children are never erased. The bones prove they lived. The legends prove they were mourned. The whispers prove they are not gone. But what, then, is the purpose of this haunting? Is it vengeance? Are the children calling out to punish the living for abandoning them? Or is it something softer, more tragic, a plea for acknowledgement, for someone to finally hear their cries and not turn away? Accounts from those who claim to have heard the voices suggest the latter. There is malice, yes, but beneath it lies sorrow. The laughter that echoes through the trees is brittle, fragile, tinged with something that sounds like weeping. The whispers are often not threats, but fragments of longing, names, cries for mothers, pleas not to be left alone. Perhaps the haunting is not meant to terrify, but to remind. If so, the forest of bones is less a curse than a mirror. It reflects back to us the darkest truths of human history, the moments when the vulnerable were abandoned, when survival eclipsed compassion, when the future was sacrificed to the present. The children in the forest are not just spectral figures of one village, one famine, one tragedy. They are the embodiment of every forsaken child across history, every forgotten victim of war, hunger, or neglect. The forest gives them a collective voice, one that refuses silence, and yet, there is still something uncanny in how it manifests. The shared dreams, the whispered names, the uncanny pull back to the trees. These cannot be explained solely by memory or metaphor. They suggest the forest is not only symbolic, but alive in its own right, a sentient wound, a consciousness formed from grief so concentrated it became a presence. If places can absorb memory, if trauma can imprint itself on the land, then perhaps the forest of bones is proof of that terrible alchemy. It is not merely haunted, it is haunting itself. Those who return from the forest often speak of an inescapable feeling that they have been seen, watched not with malice, but with expectation. The children, they say, are not merely crying out in pain, they are waiting for recognition, for justice, for remembrance. And in a way, every retelling of their story is an answer. Every investigation, every whispered warning, every ritual offering ensures they are not erased. The forest has achieved what the children themselves could not: permanence. But permanence comes with a cost. To remember them is to carry their sorrow. To step inside their forest is to share, however briefly, in their abandonment. This is the price of acknowledgement, the toll exacted for keeping their memory alive. Perhaps that is why the forest does not let people go easily. Once you have heard the laughter, once you have seen the pale faces in dreams, you cannot forget them. You have become part of the cycle, another witness bound to their chorus. And so we arrive at the final, unsettling truth. The question of what happened to the children left behind does not have a neat conclusion. Some were abandoned, some died of hunger, some were swallowed by soil, by time, by silence, and yet, somehow they remain. In bones, in dreams, in voices that refuse to be stilled, the forest ensures that their story never ends, that their cries are always carried forward, whispered to each generation that dares listen. Standing at the edge of the forest of bones, one is left with a choice: to dismiss it as legend, a haunting born of famine and fear, or to accept that some places remember, that grief itself can live on, shaping the land and those who tread upon it. Either way, the effect is the same. The forest endures, the children endure, their silence, their voices, their presence woven into the soil and the trees, waiting for the next footsteps, the next listener, the next soul willing to carry their memory. Perhaps that is the true curse of the forest of bones, not that it terrifies, but that it remembers, and in remembering, it demands that we do the same. The children were left behind once. They will not be left behind again, not while their forest still stands, not while the whispers still rise along its branches, not while we continue to tell their story. The forest of bones does not end when you step away from it. Its story lingers in every silence, in every whisper of wind through branches, in every shadow that moves at the corner of your vision when no one else is there. As we leave behind its canopy, we are left not with certainty but with echoes, echoes of laughter, of grief, of history and myth, bound so tightly together they can no longer be separated. The children left behind may never tell us their full story, but perhaps they don't need to. Perhaps their story lives not in answers, but in the unease that clings long after the questions are asked. Many documentaries end with closure, with conclusions drawn and mysteries resolved. But closure does not belong here. The forest of bones resists it, as though to give an answer would be to betray the very essence of its existence. Instead, it offers fragments, bones scattered in shallow soil, dolls left to rot at tree roots, dreams shared by strangers, voices caught on tape, stories whispered across generations. None of these fragments complete the picture, yet together they form a haunting tapestry, one that ensures we will never truly look away. Perhaps this is why the legend endures. The children left behind were forgotten once, but now they are remembered endlessly, though not in the way they may have hoped. Their tragedy has become folklore, their cries a chorus that never fades. In remembering them, we carry both grief and guilt. Grief for lives cut short, guilt for choices made in desperation, for a world that could not protect its most vulnerable. The forest ensures that we cannot forget either. And yet, there is something else, something that suggests their presence is not only grief, but invitation. To step into the forest is to be asked to bear witness, to acknowledge the lost children who once walked its paths. Some visitors sense this. They describe not fear but sorrow so heavy it bends the heart, as though the trees themselves are mourning. Others feel watched not with menace, but with yearning, as if the children are waiting for someone to listen, someone to finally stay with them. It is here, in this tension between terror and tenderness, that the forest of bones finds its power. For it does not merely frighten, it asks us to remember, and remembering is a dangerous act. To remember is to keep alive what should have been buried. To remember is to ensure that silence never wins, and silence perhaps is all the children ever feared. One final story illustrates this haunting paradox. In 2018, a traveler passing through the region claimed to have taken a detour into the forest, ignoring the warnings of locals. He stayed only briefly, filming short clips on his phone before leaving. That night, at his hotel, he reviewed the footage. In one clip, as he panned across a clearing, a faint figure appeared between two trees, a child, pale, unmoving, staring directly into the camera. Startled, he replayed the clip again and again, convinced it was a trick of light. But then, as he listened carefully, he swore he heard something else, a soft voice, buried under the sound of leaves. It spoke only one word. His name. The traveler left the region the next day, shaken but unharmed. Months later, he posted about his experience online. He admitted that the forest still haunted his dreams, that sometimes he woke in the night to the feeling of small hands brushing against his arm, but he never released the video. He deleted it instead, claiming that keeping it felt like keeping a door open, and he no longer wished for the children to follow him through. His final line in the post was simple, chilling. They only wanted me to see them, and I did. Stories like this are why the Forest of Bones endures not just as a legend, but as a living presence. It cannot be reduced to history or dismissed as folklore. It exists in the space between, feeding on attention, on remembrance, on the thin line between fear and compassion. Those who dare to enter may bring back evidence, or they may bring back silence. But one way or another, they carry the forest with them. And perhaps that is the point. So what truly happened to the children left behind? Were they abandoned in hunger and despair, their small bodies surrendered to the soil? Were they sacrificed, their deaths cloaked in ritual? Or are their spirits still there, calling out through the centuries, reaching for anyone willing to listen? The truth, like the forest itself, is layered, roots tangled deep beneath the earth, branches stretching endlessly toward the sky. Some truths belong to history, some to folklore, and some to the shadows that resist both. What remains undeniable is this: the children are not gone. Not entirely. They live in the stories, in the offerings left at the tree line, in the laughter carried across the wind. They live in the nightmares of investigators and the whispered warnings of villagers. They live in the soil, in the silence, in the eyes of those who swear they have seen them. To say they are gone would be to betray the very persistence of their presence. And so, as we step away from the Forest of Bones, we are left with more than fear. We are left with a choice: to dismiss the legend, sealing it away as nothing but myth, or to carry it with us, acknowledging that some tragedies refuse to be forgotten, some voices refuse to be silenced, and some forests refuse to let go of their dead. Neither choice brings comfort, for even dismissal, once spoken, carries its own unease. The Forest of Bones endures, waiting, waiting for footsteps at its edge, waiting for names spoken aloud, waiting for the next soul to wander in and listen. And if you listen closely, even now, perhaps you might hear them too: the faintest laughter, the softest whisper, the voices of the children left behind, reminding us that they are still here, that they will always be here, as long as the trees still stand. Perhaps that is the final truth. You cannot bury the forgotten, you can only remember them, and the Forest of Bones remembers everything,